glass half full person. You're a don't move the cups person.
Yeah.
And I'm a does the cup exist? So welcome back to the Inbound Reporting Podcast. We're so excited to have you. I'm Jory Monroe, and I'm an Inbound Professor on the Academy team.
Hi guys, I'm Nakul Kadaba. I am in HubSpot Services.
And we're so excited for you to join us for the fifth episode. So to kind of review where we are at, we've kind of walked through two steps of the inbound reporting framework. So we've covered with Kyle and Adriti what it looks like to map your flywheel and how that fits into your business. And then with Julian and Mike, we covered really setting your business goals and how to continue to align with different teams across your organization. So today, I'm so excited because we have such a special guest with us. And we're really going to start to dig into managing your data and what that looks like in HubSpot, but when it comes to integrations as well.
Yep.
So without further ado, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. So go.
Thank you. My name is Adi Shah. I am also now, as of a month ago, a professor on HubSpot Academy. I was a consultant on our professional services team before that. And before that, I used to do implementation and support. I've kind of done a lot of it at HubSpot. I've done a lot of different roles. And I'm excited to talk about this today because this is something I heard about so often from the customers I was working with, from partners I've talked to. This is a recurring challenge. And there's a way to address it. This is a very curable disease.
Yeah, and this is where I would say, Jory, this was part of the motivation of why we actually made this framework, is because when we were going into the causes of what, good practitioners reporting were doing, it's that they weren't thinking of data as the start of it.
Right.
They were thinking way beforehand.
Totally.
A lot of businesses that we've experienced, usually have gotten stuck on the data piece, mostly because they started with the data piece.
Right.
And we didn't really take into account what are your business goals and metrics, what does your business model look like, i.e. what is your flywheel, how does it move?
Yeah, and I think this is like one of the first symptoms of a larger problem is when you do have those like really empowered organizations that want to see data. They understand that data is important, but they're collecting it and it's not talking to each other. So no actionable insights are derived. So by the time they get to those visualizations, those actual reports, building those actual dashboards, they can't do it because they don't have the data. And it's not that they're not collecting it, it's that it's not in one kind of continuous place. So let's talk about data collection. Awesome. You can start.
Yeah,
Seems
sure.
Like you had a
thought. No worries. So Adi, it's great to have you here again.
It's good to be here.
Why do businesses get stuck at data collection in their reporting strategy?
I think businesses don't always know what they're looking for. And depending on what kind of industry you're in and what stage you are as a business, there are a lot of variables to consider. And I think everyone gets intimidated by those. And that's natural. All of us get intimidated by different aspects of our job. But particularly in this case, businesses almost have to start backwards and understand what their goals are and what they're trying to impress their boss with, what they're trying to impress their shareholders with. And based on those, they have to define what kind of data needs to be input. Now, there's some things that are very basic, what you and I would consider to be basic CRM data, like contact data, company data, deal data. We think that's basic. But for a lot of businesses out there that haven't really made that leap to using CRM systems, they don't really know what they don't know. And so from that perspective, there's almost this process of, okay, what goals are we trying to hit, which I believe you've talked about at some point. And this is something that will come up in our conversation today. You have to start with what goals you want to hit and then find your way into what data you need to collect and how you need to present it to the key people in your organization in order to determine whether or not you've hit those goals. So it's like a chicken or the egg problem. I would say that there's some advantage to starting with goals and going from there and then determining what you need to put in. But I've seen people do it the other way. The thing that matters in this is that you have to understand what you want to show to whom and what you're going to do based on that data. So data collection, that's why they struggle with it. It's because when you tell them data collection, they're like, what are you talking about? What data? I made my sales last month, or I think we got enough leads. But until you have an idea of what goals you're trying to hit and there's a clear vision, it's very hard to determine how that data should be collected.
That's a good leadway into the next question, because you're right. The previous 2 episodes were on defining your goals. We had talked to Julian about just what they are. We talked to Mike about building internal buy-in.
Right.
What those pitfalls, the alignment, challenges, opportunities, all that relate.
Definitely. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this was exactly the next question you wanted to do, but I wanted to kind of double down on something you said. So for a little bit of context, Adi here was like one of the most sought after consultants at HubSpot, I would argue. Mm-hmm. And so I'd like you to walk me through potentially what types of conversations would you have with those new clients that might not understand CRM data, might not understand how like the HubSpot data ecosystem really works, when really trying to tack down what information is the most important?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think I'm going to use the example of a startup.
Okay.
Because I consulted quite a few customers in the HubSpot for Startups program. Mm-hmm. Very ambitious, very driven. They have funding rounds that they're nervous about, that they want to capitalize on. So in that context, whenever I would meet companies that were enthusiastic and driven and had a team that was willing to do anything, I would start with asking them how they understood data in the first place. Okay. I'm like, what do you think data is to you? Mm-hmm. And why does it matter? Like, there's this tendency to jump after the shiny new thing, and data has become this overused buzzword.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where everyone's talking about data is essentially the new oil. There's a quote by someone I'm forgetting now. Someone important said this. Someone very important said this.
Just write it down, okay?
And the idea is like you have to know what to do with that resource. And so in this particular case, if we're thinking about like startups, I would ask them, okay, so based on your data, how do you imagine your data affecting your decision making? And then they'd say, oh, well, if we realize that this kind of prospect is actually not the best for us in terms of being lucrative or in terms of being the right audience, then we would like to dedicate our efforts to some other kind of prospect. So, okay, there's a couple of things in that, right? If you break it down, what they're trying to do, they're trying to segment their prospect list. They're trying to produce the right leads and serve them up to their sales team, which is probably one person in a startup. And they're trying to then make sense of the progress they've made in their sales by looking at that data and saying, hey, are we actually selling correctly? Mm-hmm. So just by having that conversation around what people expect data to be for them and what they want to do based on that data, that second part is really key. You can collect all the data in the world, but if you don't have something you want to do with it, then arguably you're wasting real estate in your HubSpot portal or account. So these are the 2 things that I focus on. I start with that discussion, and then I break down into things that are industry specific, KPIs that I've seen other organizations use in a similar space. I don't know if that kind of starts answering that question.
No, it does. Yeah.
So what about when you would get like an existing customer, maybe through like a handoff or like, I don't know, you get an existing customer and they might be using a couple integrations.
Yeah.
How is that conversation different?
That's a very interesting question. So it depends on the nature of the integrations.
Okay.
So first of all, what is the purpose of the integration? What kind of data? Now, what an integration is it's supposed to make both systems better.
Right.
No software is an island unto itself. You need something that connects them, and if you try to do everything in one software, sometimes you won't get a complete business solution. Right. So the first question is, what is the integration doing? How are you currently using it? Because sometimes data is coming in, but it's not really being used. It's more of we just want to keep that there because we'd get anxious if it weren't there.
Right.
But more than that, my focus is always on where do we see that data? Does your team know how to use this data? To take an example, there are folks who have integrations between Help Scout and HubSpot, and they're getting data on help tickets that have been filed, etc. Then they're trying to, sometimes they don't know how to translate that over to their sales team. Like, how do we know if someone's upset that we should try not to sell to them at that moment and instead try to make their experience better before going forward? So then we have to look into, okay, well, what's sinking in?
Right.
Can the sales reps see it? Do we have a report telling us who's not so happy and who is happy, so that we can do segmentation based on that and target the right leads at the right time and improve the experience for the others?
Yeah.
So that process of really taking a question, breaking it down into all the dependent variables, and then targeting each one of them with a data strategy. That's to me, that's what data management is. This is, you could say it's data implementation, but these terms kind of meld together a little bit.
And would you say in a larger organization where you have like that key business goal,
Yeah.
right, with those key metrics along the teams, like how are you using that? Would that be the start of, talking about your data management and collection strategy? And then how so?
That's a good point. So if you've got a couple of different teams, they're, hopefully if they've watched the goal setting podcast that you've done then they've set some sort of common goal that everyone can align around. We call it an M spot at HubSpot. And so in that context, what I start with is if there are some goals that have been set, that's great. Then we can use those to determine what pieces of data each team is contributing to that overall vision that they're trying to build. And it really breaks down into how much visibility is there into each of these data points. Are the people that need to see the data in each of these teams able to see it and do something actionable based on it? Because oftentimes you have situations in which the data exists, but the only people who are looking at it are managers who are not necessarily using the data in their day-to-day. They're so far removed from what their employees are doing, when in fact their employees are the ones who would benefit the most from the data. I see that in the context of service teams, where they don't really surface data about like recurring problems to their employees. It's this sense of just answer the ticket, move on. In reality, the folks who are answering the tickets need to be the ones determining what kind of data is collected in the first place, what kind of properties collected, how we identify a recurring issue. Developer teams, if we're talking about a software company, developer teams need to have a role in speaking to the people at services and tell them what properties they want to identify to see if a problem has occurred 5 or 10 times for different clients. So that's where all of the teams need to have a conversation about what they need to see to be successful. And then whoever's handling the data strategy for that organization needs to take all of that feedback into account, synthesize it, and then create a data strategy based on that. That benefits all of them. I didn't know if that was a little roundabout.
No. It does answer it. Yeah, because I mean that you also alluded to the types of data that's being collected. In HubSpot, I mean we call it properties. In other systems, they may call it fields. Do those different types of properties really make a difference in collecting that data? I'm sure on managing that data it makes a difference, but what about collecting it?
No, absolutely. I mean, the properties, there's a couple of different things. When you're entering data into a system, it's not as simple as just, if you have the wrong kind of property, you will end up creating data that can't be parsed or searched. There are so many examples where people have single line text fields for things that really shouldn't be single line text. And that might seem like a really nerdy point to bring up, but we're all nerds, so you're trapped. But more so, the important point here is that if people make like spelling errors, or if they mischaracterize something, or they insert colons where there aren't supposed to be, there's all kinds of things that people can do. People are very creative, including me. So in that context, if you allow for that sort of ambiguity, you're going to make it so hard to actually make sense of your data later, and you're going to create more work. Now the key there is to pick the right kind of property for the right kind of data, to understand how the team's going to use it, and then to instruct everyone to insert it the right way. And these might seem like obvious steps, but please, try to set up your own reporting strategy, and you'll realize that there's a lot of different variables because people aren't doing things the same way. And until that conversation is something that's taken seriously by the different teams, and what you're talking about, 3 different teams. Then you can't really, you can't pick the right properties because you don't know what people need. And so, you want to make their lives easier, and you want to make lives for management easier, and you want to be able to analyze that data. So yes, absolutely. You have to pick the right kind of property, and you have to pick the property that's going to reduce ambiguity, increase accuracy, and make everyone's life easier.
That answer was revenge from the nerds. Right there. Just to use that. You're trapped. Yeah.
I love that. So one thing that you mentioned that I want to drill into a little bit more is kind of that cross-team alignment. So what would happen when you get on a call with a client and it became apparent, or actually, let's even take it a step further back. How would you diagnose when there was more opportunity for cross-team alignment with your clients?
I ask very blunt questions in the beginning. I'm like, do you know what's motivating your sales director today? The marketing director is like, yeah, crickets.
Yeah.
In some cases, or in other cases, it's like, no, but I'm sure he's doing a great job. Or in another case, it's like, oh yeah, she told me, but I'm not quite sure what to do with the information because we're not really held to the same targets. Or in some cases, there's actually, for organizations that are very sales driven but haven't quite figured out that marketing sales alignment is a better strategy for them, there's actually butting of heads between the two teams where marketing is trying to prove that they got this lead, and then sales is like, nah, I talked to them 3 months before you got them. And so, in all of those things, when you have a conversation about the other team, you ask them, what's that person doing today? What is that sales director doing today? How are you looking at that sales data? Or, if you're talking to a salesperson, how are you reaching out to qualified leads identified by marketing? Asking pointed questions, and often the answer will be, I don't know. I haven't thought about that. Well, okay. Let's dig into why you haven't thought about that. So far, we haven't really needed to, they've done their job and we've done our job. And I'm like, well, you're here to embrace an inbound strategy. You're here to get those leads. Someone's got to close them. Someone's got to work them. And so it's having having higher level conversations with those who are in charge of these teams about the need to talk to each other. And particularly for sales, I say, the key way to motivate a sales team is to tell them that, hey, this will help you hit your quota quicker and will help you hit your quota better over the coming months. For marketing, similarly, getting qualified leads and talking to sales will help you create content that will get better qualified leads in the next time. And same for service. If you help us identify the best kind of leads, and we build a good service organization, you're not going to get the same kind of repetitive, unhelpful questions that you're dealing with.
Right. So you'll be able to subsequently retain them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So does that kind of answer? It's like
definitely.
Asking very blunt, to the point questions right at the beginning, and usually, as a consultant, I would start with the disclaimer. I'm going to ask questions that could be unpleasant, but I don't think you would have hired me if I was here to coddle you. And you're here to grow. And so if there are areas for improvement, I will tell you, because my selfish interest is seeing you super successful in the course of the next few months. Definitely. And so I think setting that expectation is also important.
So how often, once you encourage clients to start to have these conversations, how often were you kind of telling them to have meetings with potentially people across different teams, or check in at least with the reports? What types of reporting behavior were you trying to instill?
That's a really good point. One thing I found that was effective is we have this ability in the HubSpot tool to send reports out automatically, dashboards. Those automated emails, some people seek them out right from the beginning. Others don't know that this is a possibility. And so part of what I've tried to do, especially when there are communication problems between teams, a lot of teams are remote these days. So they're not even in the same place. So getting a meeting with someone and building trust is a difficult thing. Like, we live in a world where, everyone's essentially floating head on a screen. But at the same time, having some sort of relationship building experience is really important for leaders in an organization. So before, that's a longer process. I tell them that you need to set up meetings. You know what? Bring them to my call. We're just gonna muscle through and build this relationship. Let's go. But if that's not possible, then let's start by understanding what metrics they care about. Maybe you already know. You know what you care about, obviously, hopefully. If not, we'll figure that out too. And you know what the other organization, the service organization, cares about. So let's bring that all together and start constructing some kind of a dashboard. And then let's have it send out to people at the beginning. So the first time people see it, they'll be surprised. They're like, what is this? Or wait, that's not exactly the metric I want to track. Voila, we have a conversation.
You have a conversation right there.
And so I don't want to say forcing the conversation, but I'm going to say forcing the conversation in some cases.
But it's through data. But it's through data, and I think that's the point you're trying to bring up. Because generally, it's an approach that I've seen in my exposure as well, where if you just show a report that, for example, shows nothing, all of a sudden, your customer speaks out and says, why is there nothing on this? There should be something on this. Oh, where is it? And then you start kind of diving in further down. So, we talked about, property types, and different forms of data and how they're coming up as a challenge. We talked about people being in all remote corners of the world as another challenge. And what are the other challenges you've kind of seen in data collection in particular?
Yeah. Yeah, I think some of those definitely hit the nail on the head. The other thing I've seen people struggle with, especially when it comes to getting the right data, I think they struggle with getting their teams to actually do the step of putting that data in, because there's a thin line between overwhelming your team and keeping their trust. Yeah. Teams that have to enter tons of data, especially if you've been on sales calls all day and you have no time, and let's say you give them 34 properties to fill out after every call.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
They're gonna.
That's a lot.
Yeah, they're gonna mutiny you. So they'll throw you overboard the ship. So like in this case, I don't really blame it. It's really hard. So you have to. It takes some work on part of the person in charge of the data strategy to determine exactly what they need to collect in order to keep the ship moving. Now, in this case, sometimes you do have to push that. And so that's where, you have to, whatever you're asking them to do that is additional to what they've been doing already, you need to actually have a rationale for that.
Right.
And so this seems like a small thing, but business change or change management for businesses is the hardest thing. Most businesses fail at it.
Right.
But if you can instill that culture of, this is for your own good that we're collecting this data so that we can make your lives easier and do better as a business and all of us go home a little happier, that conversation is really critical because, yes, you can have the wrong properties. You can correct that. You could be collecting the wrong sort of data. Okay, you can correct for that. But now that you know the right kind of data you want to collect, you have to pick and choose what part of it is feasible for the team to do.
And your answer is really an extension of last episode when we talked with Mike about saying, it's not necessary. It's not enough to just tell your team, this is our goal, this is our metrics, here's the process that we're going to do it. Reaching out to other teams as well and understanding what they care about, right? And saying, well, this is how we're going to relate to that.
Definitely.
Right? And this is it, just by saying this is the data that we're going to collect to validate that we're achieving our goal in metrics. We're also achieving the organizational business goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And really instilling that sense of purpose along the way, right? Where it's like, it's not just you're collecting this data, but your team knows why you're collecting this data and how it will help them in the future so that they're more likely to kind of continue the machine. That makes a lot of sense. So what types of organizations or industries did you find struggled with data collection in particular?
Yeah. I think there's certain organizations that historically have. So I think when it comes to sales, it's interesting where there's some organizations that have relied on the ingenuity of sales reps almost too much in the past.
Okay.
Sometimes real estate strikes me as an example of that.
Okay.
In my experience, where they are. It's not that they don't want to use the data. They've been used to not needing it in some cases. Okay. Because they're like, I don't need this. I can close it, which is great. You should have that confidence as a rep. You should be able to step in a room and close. But at the same time, this advantage is eroding at this point. Data is really critical for that industry and for many other industries. I would say there are other challenges, particularly with. Medical companies around data collection and storage and
regulations
all of that.
About that.
Yeah, HIPAA. And so, that's when I've seen data collection can be tough and you have to have an organized data strategy. So in the case where someone is working, for example, in a medical industry with a software that isn't HIPAA compliant, and most marketing automation is not. HubSpot is not, and it's because you can do marketing automation without having sensitive data in there. Yeah. Then you have to evolve a data strategy where, going back to our point of integrating, you have to have HubSpot integrate with a HIPAA compliant CRM, and have the sensitive data safely stored. In the HIPAA compliant
and not syncing over.
Exactly, not syncing over. But you know what? You don't need it to sync over because when you're doing marketing or sales, you don't necessarily need to use that sensitive data. And so from that perspective, like knowing when to put what data in and being very aware of the regulations in your industry. Okay. And in the case of real estate, actually being a bit more open-minded and realizing that, the tactics of the old world are no longer effective.
Right.
And we need to adjust or we will perish. So from that perspective, I think it can be tricky in a number of different industries. There's also industries where we don't know what data to collect yet. There are companies that are working on emerging, AI companies, where they have some clue of the kind of data they need to collect. Typical sales data, typical marketing data. But there's data surrounding usage that they haven't defined for their apps. There's data surrounding behaviors of the people who are using those apps. So I think in all of these cases, it can be tricky for any organization, but these are some examples I've seen.
Awesome. So what about on the flip side when you would encounter a CRM or like a client, for example, that would have a lot of data, but it wouldn't be like cohesive or clean? Like what would you do for, say, someone joined an organization and they have a lot of data, but it's just not talking to each other or it's not been effectively managed? What's the first step there?
Yeah, it depends on the nature of the mismanagement.
Okay.
So if we're dealing with a situation where a lot of cooks in the kitchen, we have a lot of different people managing data, and we've got properties repeated, we've got the wrong kinds of properties repeated. So you can't easily just like turn on a workflow and copy from one to another because they're not even the same property. There's various complex issues. At that point, there's no completely painless way to do this. I mean, you could hire someone to do it, but then you're what you would be putting in as time, you're now paying that person to do. You're paying for it directly. So from that perspective, I would say the only way to deal with like a complex situation like that is to take stock of every single property each team is currently using, determine which ones they're using, determine which ones they aren't, and the ones that are duplicate, you clean up. The ones that are configured incorrectly, you go in and you configure them correctly. And you may also discover in this, often in these cases, you have leads in the database that shouldn't be there in the first place. Because the people do things like they take their entire LinkedIn list and they put that into HubSpot. They'll take everything from their boss's phone and import all those leads. And I don't think your boss's grandma really needs to see the latest sales promotion. You think I'm joking?
She could be. She could be really interested. You never know, Adi.
Yeah,
shouldn't presume like that.
That's true. That's true. I mean, but the response.
But chances are.
Chances are, yeah. I know what you're saying.
There was a response for action. She's like, "I'm so proud of you, Bobby."
Based on a real type case.
Yeah, he's like, "This is such a you've come such a long way. You're running a business."
I love your business. Clicks email.
Clicks the email, opens, responds, fills out the form for software she doesn't really know or understand. But in some cases they do. But all in all, what I'm saying is this is a funnier example. There are not so funny examples where people are not supposed to email people. It really shouldn't be there in the database. And given that we have an international audience and GDPR is an important thing to be aware of.
That's right.
And now even CCPA in the States.
Yep, CCPA.
Correct. Keeping in mind that we don't want people in there who don't belong in there. And often with databases that are mismanaged, that is inevitably the case. Gotcha. So being aware of all the risks that are like when I encounter customers who are not willing to clean up their database, I have to educate them on the risks and say that I'm telling you all of these things so that you are making an educated decision. Right. If you ask me what I would do, I would clean this up first.
Right.
And you can do it side by side with your reps. Nothing has to come to a grinding halt. It isn't nuclear science. It just takes like time, effort, and dedication to do it. And I've seen certain customers, I can't take everyone's names, but do a fantastic job. I think the customers that do a great job at data cleaning themselves are those led by someone who's used marketing automation in some way before. They have an idea of what data
product
is
exposure.
Important. Exactly. Product exposure, not just HubSpot, elsewhere too. And they can apply those. So I think that's really the key. It's understanding the risks of a complex database, taking stock of each and every property and how it's being used, which is painful but necessary, and you got to do it sometime. And then using that audit as an opportunity to improve upon existing processes that are flawed. So
I'm glad you brought up the audit because certain privacy laws and regulations like GDPR or CCPA, have come up, at least in my exposure, dealing with customers. How is that conversation different, or how is it, accentuated? How is that audit accentuated by the fact that I have to think about this privacy law? I have to think about how I'm going to be collecting it because I don't want to violate anything legally. I don't want to be in legal trouble.
No, it's absolutely true. I mean, in that case, one of the things as a HubSpot consultant we were trained to do is be very careful about saying that we do not give legal advice.
Yep.
Right.
We can't. We can tell you what HubSpot can do.
Can we get a disclaimer just on the bottom of this? Just saying we are not lawyers. Not any of us.
Not qualified to give any sort of legal advice.
But know the law.
Yeah, but no.
No. You should know the law. HubSpot has some fantastic resources.
Yeah.
Actually published by Academy.
Shameless plug.
Of course. Shameless plug for the both of us. And so in this case, I think consulting those resources is one thing, but also I have implored the heads of data organizations to speak to a lawyer. And usually when you say something like that, it sounds like, did I do something wrong? I'm like, no, you didn't do anything wrong, Mike. You need to talk to a lawyer because I can't tell you what you should do in that sense. I can tell you these are the resources available to you, and this is the law.
And these are real risks.
Real risks. That's right. And so there's this sense of, they're not going to do anything. Well, I'm like, you don't want to play with that kind of a risk.
Do you know that for sure?
Yeah.
Do you know that for sure? Yeah.
They don't.
Yeah.
And so, it's like you want to be very risk averse when it comes to this. Because it's one of those things that's so easily corrected.
Right.
It's like going out and standing in the middle of the road. And it's incredibly risky, and hopefully in Boston no one would, you'd be safe because pedestrians are king. But
sort of. It depends on where in Boston you are.
It depends, right. It's one of those things where it's not worth taking on additional risk.
Right.
And we try to be very clear about what those are and arm people with the resources, and then teach them about the HubSpot tools that help them mitigate their risk and be better marketing citizens.
And I love that advice, not legal advice, but
Right.
Not
perception
legal advice.
That you should think about your data management in light of these new regulations, because I think what was interesting to watch unfold when GDPR was kind of new and being implemented was you might think that you have like your data management down to a science, but when looked at like in light of these new regulations, like it just might be eye-opening in terms of how you're collecting your data. My phone is ringing and it's very distracting.
Yeah, I was like,
but yeah, so
what is that noise?
yeah. But I think it adds a new facet to thinking about how your data is managed. So know the law.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, but consult a lawyer.
Right, but consult a lawyer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, every HubSpot consultant would say the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Any consultant worth their money will say the same thing to you.
Yeah.
So,
Let's chat about we kind of went on kind of the risks and the challenges and the pitfalls that you could see. What if it goes well? Because I know
Not gloom and
still
doom.
trying to be that glass half full kind of guy
Yeah.
here. Because I'm sure for all of those situations where you've had to have those serious conversations, you've also probably had conversations where it's gone well.
Yeah.
And you've been an organization has gotten buy-in. You haven't had to do so much like change management consulting to get them bought in.
Yeah.
And maybe it's just the case of let's make sure that this is the process that you have to follow.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's always fun as a consultant when someone is ready to go.
Yeah.
I've had times when customers are impatient about their data strategy, and I think they're doing a great job. I've had startups that are, when it comes to their data, they're like, Adi, we have all this data here. These are the dashboards we've built. These are the 3 different systems we have. And we want you to tell us what we're missing. And that question is both challenging and a lot more enjoyable because they have clear goals that they're trying to hit and they've built their data around that. In those cases, like it comes down to like what they need their data to tell them that it's not telling them at the moment. So I'll give you some examples. There are companies that are doing some really interesting stuff in biotech.
Okay.
Where they have to, get behavioral data from the user of whatever product they've produced. And then square that with marketing and sales data. And that's when, HubSpot now does cross-object reporting. So that offers some obvious advantages there, and along with, in the enterprise suite, like calculated properties and other things that are across the hub. So that's where there's an opportunity to take the existing data and actually compare it in ways that weren't possible before.
Right.
And so HubSpot can do an awful lot. In fact, I've had situations where I get companies that have been doing business very well without a CRM. They come online to HubSpot and they realize that all of their Excel hacking can be replaced by intelligent cross-object reports.
Yep.
Right.
And that's not, the concept of cross-object reporting is not something HubSpot invented. It's
Right.
been out there. So this isn't me just, shamelessly plugging for the tool.
Yeah.
But I think what we've done is identify the need for these organizations and given them a solution that actually reduces the amount of work they have to do.
Yeah.
And gives them a better solution. So from that perspective, I don't know if that starts to get at the answer for
No, it does.
a good
Yeah.
organization,
Yeah.
finding them, showing them novel ways to interpret their data.
And tools and techniques that you use. I mean, you mentioned calculated properties. You mentioned cross-object reports. I mean, are there any others that kind of spring to mind when you're kind of walking them through, good and bad?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Cases.
The segmentation tools that are available in HubSpot should be overused.
Okay.
You can't really overuse them. And so, whether it comes to, something as, I won't say simple, but something as well known as lists.
Yeah.
Or using filters intelligently and thinking of all possible reasons why you'd need to action a particular list. So often folks are like, I'm not quite sure how to build the right list of leads for this particular promotion. Well, all right. Well, what are you looking for? Is this for everyone who's interested in this product or service? Okay, let's look at everyone who's expressed interest in an article related to this topic. Let's look at everyone who's spoken about one of these topics with their sales reps on a conversation and that was tagged in a property. Let's create a list that pulls from all of the different organizations and gives you a complete picture. So using the segmentation tools like saved filters, lists, to actually pull in that information and then segmenting within reports themselves as well. And so, those are some of the tools that I think are very helpful from a kind of a cursory perspective in helping us delve into that. But there's, there are many other places HubSpot gives you data. There's analyze, there's reports for blogs, there's reports for email marketing.
Yeah.
We are trying to make it easier to find all of these reports in one place. And yeah, the list is quite large, but I think those are some of the basic tools and strategies I recommend. Like start with building a good list of lists and saved filters and reports that you can rely on. And then from there, we can cross them and get creative. And what I love most is when the organization starts getting creative with the data themselves and they start asking me questions that are, I'm like, wow, actually, you know what? I think you're right. I think this is the only possible way to do this. And he's like, I knew it, because he had invested that time in in learning the system. So I don't know if that's an appropriate way to phrase that. Yeah.
Absolutely. So when do you start recommending that people kind of automate their data management?
From the beginning.
Okay.
I think there are times when automation should not be pursued because
when are those times? Let's dig into that first.
Yeah, absolutely. So automation should not be done if you don't understand. So there's a saying that says, don't move the cups when you're new to a team without understanding why the cups were there in the first place.
Right.
Okay.
So
I love that.
Yeah, don't move the cups.
Don't move the cups.
And so part of this is if you think that a process is broken and you're sitting up in your ivory tower of being the VP of marketing, no digs at VPs of marketing. I love all of you, but if you I've seen this case of this is broken, we need to fix it. I'm like, what's your team doing? He's like, I don't know. Yeah. I'm like, so you want to turn on this workflow that's going to completely change their experience in the tool without talking to them.
Yeah.
And in one case, it's like, they'll have to do what I said. I'm the marketing VP. And predictably it led to complete chaos for the next week. People were...
so you're going to move these cups. When...
I'm not saying they were crying bloody murder, but it was,
right.
It was this sense of like, we don't know what's going on in our organization anymore. I don't know why I'm assigned these contacts. I don't know what's going on. Help me, please.
It's business change.
Right.
Exactly. And part of this is... when you don't automate something when you don't understand how it's done first.
So take stock first.
Absolutely. Understand, don't move the cups without understanding why they're there.
I'm going to use that all the time.
Yeah, that's actually a really good strategy.
New favorite.
And then from there, you have to understand why when you move the cups, you have to tell people why you've moved the cups and make sure that you're actually, this is where the metaphor ends. I guess I could say something about like moving cups efficiently, but I won't go there. I'll say that you want to create automation that actually makes people's lives easier.
Yeah.
And so from that perspective, there's 3 steps. Take stock of what's happening. Don't move the cups. Figure out what cups need to be moved, and then tell people, and then ask them for feedback.
This is why the cups are moving.
Exactly. And like, is this helpful
Are
to
you cool with me moving the cups?
This is the purpose, to kind of go back to like some of the themes that we're creating of moving the cups.
Yeah. And you also need to identify when certain processes are not broken to begin with. There are certain things, there are workflows that are built out all the time that are never used.
Interesting.
Because they spend all this time building out this workflow, and they realize, you know what? We need like 2 steps from this, and the team can do it. And they find that easy, and you know what? You got to pick your battles. If you got to keep your eye on the prize. You're not trying to radically change everything in one evening, which some people definitely try.
Especially with workflows.
Yeah, absolutely. They feel very powerful. I think it's like playing God for a moment. You're like, I can flex so many powers at once.
Change all these properties.
Change all of the properties.
Reports who?
Yeah, absolutely. But the problem with that, getting intoxicated by that power is that you are quite possibly introducing more complexity into the lives of your team.
Right.
So
we see that all the time. I mean, I'm sure all 3 of us have seen that, where we look at maybe a workflow and you have to zoom out all the way and you still can't see the whole thing. And then you ask the simple question, which Adi, I'm sure you've asked, what is this doing?
Yeah. Why does this exist?
Internally, even for the internal ones, what is this exactly doing? And then you may get an answer, and if you get that answer and it's confident enough, great.
Yep.
Totally fine. But sometimes you get those crickets chirping, and you're like,
So,
are you sure you know why this is running, or are you sure that this should be running?
I just got like this very clear flashback of one of my days in support where I got this call, and it was to the point where it's like it was troubleshooting a workflow, and we had to zoom out so far that I think my computer screen was like at 10%, and I still couldn't scroll over.
You still couldn't see the whole thing. You couldn't see
and
the
I
whole
remember
thing. Yeah.
that was a point when I used the best power pause of my life, and I was just like. Explain like what is going on, like what is the purpose of this? And I'm sure Adi, you were in support too. You remember those days, and I think always to kind of go back to another theme that we're kind of establishing with data, always starting with the why. Like, why does this exist? Why are you
collecting this?
Is there a way to be more efficient if you, rather than 56 branches, if you could do it in one? Especially if you could consolidate things into like similar properties.
Right. Because the reporting implication is pretty straightforward from this point of the framework, right?
Yeah.
If you understand your business model, you got your flywheel, you've defined your goals and the metrics by the team, right? Then we're getting into data collections. Like, well, we know that the data that we collect should supposedly answer the question or address the point of, did we achieve our metric, i.e. did we contribute towards our business goal to make our flywheel spin faster, right? It's how we want to showcase that.
Absolutely.
And Adi talked about, we were talking about property types, right? Depending on whether you have something like a single line text or a number versus radio select versus, any of the other ones I cannot think of right now, can really show a cleaner set of reports or visualization that you can show later.
Absolutely. So on the flip side of that question, what are some good use cases of like automating where it's like the team should just like not have to worry about this at all?
Yeah, thankfully there's a bigger list there. I mean, I think some examples that I've seen very obviously, and I'm going to call a few of them out. With sales, we have this property in HubSpot called Lead Status. And this isn't actually really that nerdy at all. It's something that salespeople understand very intrinsically. They need to understand where the lead is in the process. Have they reached out to them? I mean, these are basic organizational tools. And so you can actually automate them using workflows. So like if a salesperson sends out an email, hey, they don't need to go in and mark that they've sent out the email. HubSpot recognizes that the email's been sent out and will automatically mark it as having gone out. If the salesperson then books a call with this person, you know what? If they're using HubSpot Sales Suite, HubSpot will recognize that the call has been booked and will mark it as meeting booked. So this way you can remove, it's almost like there's an assistant working side by side with a sales rep, kind of doing the what I call the boring, the boring work, because it is, it's important. Important good things can often be a little boring.
Right.
But if you don't need them to do it, and they can spend more time going and actually, building connections and relationships, then it's pointless to put them through that. There are cases where people are actually doing a lot of manual work to try and sort through leads and score them and determine if they're important. That's where automation can jump in and make their lives a lot easier. On the marketing end, automation can help you identify your most engaged website visitors and target them with the right kind of content. On service, automation can help you identify the most pressing issues based on, the ticket that's been submitted, and then escalate them to the right person. I could go on and on. This is going to take 3 hours.
No, that's okay.
3
No,
days,
we got
3
time.
months.
We got time.
But the idea is that there's so many ways in which automation can make your life easier. The place to start is by asking people, if you could wave a magic wand, how would you change this process and make your life easier? How would you imagine you'd be doing this if you were 100 years into the future? How do you imagine you'd do this?
Right.
I love that question. That's actually something that Academy, to like kind of gut check our own processes. We were just actually in a meeting that had a very similar exercises running that with our team. So that's a definitely helpful question to ask.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Automation is not magic, but it's helpful to think of it in that sense, because it's there to reduce your burden and make life easier and make it more accurate. And honestly, in many cases, automation actually guarantees data integrity, because oftentimes people can't fill out everything they're supposed to fill out, and it makes it hard to analyze what worked later.
Yeah.
Automation ensures that you can get to it.
And I like that as a point too, because it's like once you add human input into the fold, that's the word I'm looking for, you have the potential for human error. And especially that's why single text fields can be so dangerous. And maybe dangerous is a strong word for that, but it can really mess up your reporting, because it's so easy for humans to make mistakes, especially
provided that data point should not be in a single text format.
Totally.
And I think Adi also hit on this too, that even if you're not starting at the beginning with automation, which may not be the case with a majority of businesses, because they're not starting at day zero or day one, right? You still have things like filters. You still have things like bulk CRM editing of those properties to say, I'm going to go in and try to tackle this instead of one by one. I'm going to try to do this 100 at a time or something based on common attributes that I already exist between these contacts, right? Or companies or don't exist. Correct.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like workflows is one tool, but like Nakul was saying, bulk CRM editing is another great thing. It's people who use Excel before and are troubled by Excel love bulk CRM editing for how simple the interface is.
I love Excel.
I love Excel too, and I'll say that I love the way that we can do these things in HubSpot. And so, I think taking account of all the different tools that exist in HubSpot, not just workflows, that help you add a dash of automation to your life. And in
just
this case,
sprinkle.
just a sprinkle, or sometimes the whole bowl, depending on how much you need.
Automation.
Just as long as it's not cinnamon, that's all.
That's I guess. No, well, I don't mind cinnamon, but like in this case,
I'm thinking like the cinnamon
challenge. That's what I was thinking about. That maybe not the whole bowl of cinnamon. That's like
No.
That's a lot of cinnamon.
That's an awful lot. That's different. I didn't understand the context, but
I love that we just knew.
I'm out of sync here.
That's fine. Nicole and I spend a lot of time together.
We do actually.
That's
yes.
fine.
But that's the point. I mean, because I'm sure in your time as a consultant, or even as your time in both your times, maybe in support, I know for sure in support you were dealing with customers that came in the middle of this strategy, right? Of some sort, right? As a consultant, Adi, you probably were dealing with some net news that were coming on for the first time, but you probably were also dealing with businesses that were in the middle. And so you had to say, well, it looks like it's going to be a combination of let's bulk edit or filter what we have now. Going forward, let's automate. So that there's not as much burden on the same people again,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that occurs to me is we've talked about net new companies. We've talked about bringing companies to their baseline right now. It's like bringing them to zero. If they're coming from a new organization. Or even if they're in the middle, finding out exactly what they need to succeed. There's also some forward thinking involved here. Like what one customer of mine calls delightful automation. Thinking forward about what we're going to need a couple of months from now, or what our customers are going to need a couple of months from now, and just going that extra step to show that you can use automation to actually make your sales process, your marketing process, your service process more human. Because you can engage with them at the right time, you can send them the right reminders, you can summarize things for them. There's potential for so much proactive problem solving with automation. It's not purely reactive.
So do you have any recommendations for like if an individual contributor identifies that there's like a use case for automation, how to start to have those conversations? Or even on the flip side, if it's a manager talking to a director or a director to a VP, like how to almost have those conversations where there's been a use case identified almost downstream, if you will, that could really help and elevate the entire kind of team or org with automation?
That's a good point. I honestly think that the best use cases always come from individual contributors.
Right.
And any manager that doesn't listen to their individual contributors' reporting needs is just not doing a good job.
Right.
And I think that most do listen. And most managers are actually, that I've spoken to, I can't really think of anyone who hasn't.
Good.
Who's been a HubSpot customer, who they're avidly looking forward to their reps telling them. In certain cases, in legacy sales teams, or even mostly in sales teams, I'd say, because marketing has always had this need to like look at the data to see how they're doing.
Efficiency almost,
But with sales teams, they're incredible high performers who don't really need to look at anything. They have the gift.
Yeah.
But now the issue with that is like that's great, but we want to actually recreate that so that everyone can sell better.
Yep.
And that's where I think like having direct conversations and creating incentives for people to put in the right kind of data. So rewarding top performers for leading the charge on a data initiative.
Yeah.
Creating roles for enablement when it comes to sales, so that top performers who are doing really well, hey, you know what? This is an example. We'll pull you out of the funnel. Go and help everyone else sell well. And that's another kind of intelligent investment of resources in certain teams, I've said, where they've taken top salespeople and slowly they've had them coach others so that everyone's numbers go up, as opposed to one person,
almost
kind of carrying the team.
Like an environment of learning from your data.
Exactly, and it's all comes down to data, because the top performers, especially when it comes to more modern companies, are using data in some sense or the other.
Yep.
And even if it's instinct, it can be pulled back. It can be brought back to data. Exactly. And that can be identified and democratized for the team. And so I think that's where I see individual contributors do a great job, is when they're given the right incentives and management is open to hearing them and respects their opinion. Yeah. That's when they give their best advice and it propels the whole organization forward.
That makes sense.
Right. And I love how you're saying, amplifying one's impact, right? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to just sales, although sales is a really good set of examples here. Yeah. But it also could be marketing, it could be services, it could be product, it could be, we had Mike on, on product. Yeah. It could be any organization within a particular business.
Yeah.
Right.
That is attempting to collect data in some aspect.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
So. Well, great. I know we're just coming close to the 1 hour mark on this time. We did, first off, thanks Adi for having you on.
Pleasure.
This is great.
Thanks for having me.
As a follow-up, guys, we last time had a SWOT analysis as an asset. This time we have an asset that will ask you to list your business goal, your portal ID, just so we know exactly who you are. And then the types of data that you are going to be looking to collect based on that business goal and or metrics.
Absolutely.
So that we can give you some feedback. If you'd like to send it to us, please email us at inboundreporting@hubspot.com. And thanks very much.